Hi, I think we're going to get started here. So congrats to everyone who made it here 10 a.m. after probably a long night last night. I see some friends maybe with bags under their eyes, but they're here, which is great. Before I get started, I was curious how many people in the audience have a strong interest or background in enterprise blockchain? I'm just sort of curious about that. Okay, a couple of hands. Well, hopefully this talk will have something for everyone. So just a little bit about my background. It was actually fun. I put this talk together just for EthCC. I've been in the space for about 8 years now. Originally was at IBM, helped launch the first blockchain as a service in the industry, the first open source contribution that was geared towards enterprise, and helped work with the Linux Foundation and the Hyperledger, and now I've come full circle with some contributions there with some other projects. And started Kaleido, actually was one of the early Consensus Venture Studio investments, so a lot of old friends here in Paris for EthCC, and got to the privilege of starting Kaleido with some awesome co-founders. So what I wanted to talk about today was just a chance to reflect the journey of enterprise blockchain, its early beginnings, some lessons learned, and then really from that first generation, what's happening now with the second generation of projects, and then how we could take some of those lessons as we're crossing the chasm technology-wise. So really thinking about it, going back, it seems like we've been in the space for about 8 years. 2015, there were a number of different projects and initiatives all happening, realizing that enterprises were looking at the technologies that were being developed in blockchain. They were really interesting with privacy and some other considerations. They were looking at how they could enter the space and do some meaningful work. One lesson from the Gen 1 approach, when it takes an average of 3 to 5 years to get one use case to market, $30 to $50 million, hundreds of thousands of lines of custom code that you're writing just for that project. It's really hard to get to a return on investment for that for businesses. And for some of us, it was pretty clear from the early days that if these become huge consulting projects that just take a very long time in the life cycle of a company, it's all about, are you really driving value for your users? And is there some that value being expressed by some sort of return on the investment that the companies are making? So, actually, this is one of my favorite memes, Disaster Girl. But it sort of, for me, reflects a little bit of what was going on with the Gen 1 approach. I mean, just very long, drawn-out projects. Again, tens and tens of millions of dollars. If you look at Australian Stock Exchange during the FTX collapse, I guess they decided it was good timing for some of these projects to come out of the woodworks because they thought it was almost a rounding error on what was happening in that space. And but ASX wrote off $250 million. It was a 7-year project, and I'd say the others were in the range I was talking about previously, more of the 3 to 5 year variety. So where are they now? Some of those projects didn't make it. One thing to keep in mind with any transformative technology, organizational change experts say that 70% of organizational change initiatives fail, and has a lot to do with people and processes, much more so than the tech. And a lot of times you need something like a burning platform to affect change. So, as you keep in mind some of the macroeconomic factors, there's been a lot of articles, and people debating both sides of it. I'd say Gen 1 approach is dead. Gen 2 lives on, and as you look at macroeconomic factors like COVID, where the world had to digitize overnight, immediately, that burning platform really did, take place. And we see that even the most conservative industries like healthcare and insurance had to realize, our brokers can't sit in an office pushing paper. They need to work from home. How are we going to transform overnight? So one thing I like to think about in the blockchain space is Amaro's law. So we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate it in the long run. So this is the sentiment behind this slowly then suddenly type sentiment. You'll hear sometimes on LinkedIn or other comments. And generally, it translates to about 10 years in the overestimating phase, and then the next 10 years you're underestimating. So as I was reflecting, being 8 years in, really feels like we're starting to see that inflection point happening. And as you just turn on the news, read the paper, just daily affirmations by, the largest companies. If you look at BlackRock, #1 assets under management, I think like 10 trillion, saying that, finance is being revolutionized. People are talking about the tokenization of everything. And this is all the way from, finance companies to all sorts of companies, in the industrial space, whether you're looking at, mining companies or, supply chain, healthcare, retail, et cetera. So, what enterprises are looking at today and projects kicking off, are really quite across the gambit now. I think in the early days, people looked a lot at multi-party consortia, but now there's a lot of value an individual company can realize just by adopting some of those technologies for their own initiatives, better way to reach their customers, new products and services, as well as working better with their partners and relationships in the industry. So one thing, I showed the disaster girl meme. It turns out I didn't realize this. She actually grew up pretty close to where I live, and she was a college student at UNC, which is 5 minutes from my house. University of North Carolina. So she ended up, when she was in college, selling the photo as a meme, and then got $500,000 for it, and used that to help pay her student loans. So I think this is a great example of, technology's evolving. It ends up being used in all sorts of different ways, and you have what we're finding used in certain aspects, then really disseminating more into popular culture. So with Gen 2 blockchain, what's really important is, is there business value, or, is the use case even make sense? I'd say in the early days, a lot of times with the new technology, you can have the dynamic of hammer looking for a nail, which obviously isn't the right way to go about it. Can you get time to value? Is that in days or weeks versus months or years? And then all sorts of different ways enterprises now are really bringing in technology into their use cases. They might start on a zero gas or low gas chain, but then really looking for being able to move those assets to the public space depending on the use case. For example, gaming companies, you have millions of in-game assets. They want to do that on a chain that's a low gas or no gas, but some of those assets will be valuable. You can move them to another game in their portfolio or even to an open exchange. Areas like decentralized identity is something that we're really seeing become quite popular as well. So in the early days, as I mentioned, a lot of the use cases were about B2B and sharing data between multiple participants in industry. But we've really seen a lot of B2C use cases, so new products, new services, new ways to connect with your customers. And then just whole new business models where, in one case, I'll show you the slide, that a group of healthcare companies are saying, we're all collecting the same data. Let's use a tokenized incentive, basically an enterprise stablecoin that offboards to fiat, to align everyone doing the right thing in this network around contributing the clean data that we all agree to, and then people who want to subscribe to the data need to pay for it. So if you look at waves in the broader space, obviously we started with crypto, one use case, DeFi, tens of use cases. We're really moving into wave 3 now, where there's thousands of use cases, and of course all the corresponding technologies that enable that. As I mentioned, you're really looking at the digital transformation that all the companies worldwide had to look at very closely with COVID. And we saw a very strong acceleration of about a decade. Lots of examples of just, are the masks genuine? Where's the toilet paper was a big topic in the US. Testing kits, et cetera, that really exposed a lot of the issues in ecosystems. And we really do see a lot of these new digital ecosystems emerging. I want to throw a couple examples in. I'll go through really quickly, but just this Gen 2 approach. So last summer, Swift, I mentioned the Australian Stock Exchange example, which was 7 years and a huge write-off. Swift was looking at all the different country and ecosystems doing central bank digital currency work and said, we'd like to bring everyone together and see, is there a way we can help really as a gateway and a connector between these different ecosystems. So in the Gen 1 approach, this would have been a 3 to 5 year project. In the Gen 2 approach, in a matter of a developer sprint, they had stood up a product stack, the CBDC infrastructure, fully compliant, SOC 2 Type 2, ISO 27K, all of that. And central banks, the most highly regulated space, were able to onboard and actually focus on business use cases and how would they interact, PVP, DVP, and other types of models. So I think that's a really great example of just being able to move quickly. And in the case of CBDCs, the answer is not going to be discovered overnight. So you need to work together as an ecosystem, and you need to focus on the real business experimentation and not spend years just trying to get the plumbing going. Australia did a very similar step forward with a research institute to DFCRC, and they actually have 15 different live projects, all from fintechs to largest companies in the world like MasterCard. And again, the same sort of approach in a matter of weeks, being able to get the infrastructure up, very quickly go through phase 1, phase 2. They had over 100 submissions to participate, chose 15, and have been live for the last 4 or 5 months. Very large payment networks that have been in productions for a number of years. In the case of the US, the domestic ACH networks, remittances payments, more conservative industries like oil and gas saying, here's really technology we can work together. They have, a dozen different use cases they're working on, some of which are, ESG, others are more like supply chain track and trace type of use cases. Covantis actually is based in Switzerland, and they're in year 3, hundreds of companies working on the network. And then these were competitors who came together and said, as an industry, to drive down costs and really address some issues and pain points we have, we need to work together. And this technology helps people who are even competitors work together in the way that can accomplish that. Healthcare, this is the use case I was mentioning. They've been live for a number of years and using tokenized incentives to drive the right behaviors. Insurance, this particular consortium has dozen plus projects as well. Just recently announced parametric insurance was live in production with Arbol as well in the last couple of weeks. And then, of course, across consumer, ed tech, the classic supply chain track and trace. So I just want to throw some examples in to, if I'm saying we're in Gen 2, so you actually see, companies are doing this. I looked over the agenda, and there's a lot of talks with a lot of names of different projects and companies. I'm sure you'll see that. So once some of these companies or collaborative efforts have their first or second use case, how do you scale? It could be complex because there's a lot of different layers across the app and infrastructure. Sometimes companies talk about working with 17 different vendors, open source communities, different product stacks. So they really need a one-stop shop, more of a plug-and-play approach. Blockchain could be 5 to 10% of the solution. You need all the other layers as well. Now there's a lot of open source. Hyperledger Firefly has 1 million lines of code. It's Apache 2, open to anyone. A lot of the projects I mentioned are all using this, and this is part of the acceleration. Developers can also, Web 2 developers can just access this with RESTful APIs. You don't need to have deep Web 3 skills, although you can do the native RPC calls as well if you'd like. And then I just want to comment briefly on the rise of app chains. Sometimes people still talk about this dichotomy between public and private. And there's really a whole spectrum of chains. We see enterprises working across this whole spectrum. App chains is a very interesting space. I probably don't have enough time to get into it. But as we cross the chasm, one thing everyone's been talking about for a while is that it's really the user experience, that easy button. So being able to onboard the early majority, what does that mean? It needs to have really the right experience, needs to be bring all the application developers online, and then also meet all of the requirements you need in the enterprise space. So from day one, actually, our mission at Kaleido was to really radically simplify adopting these new technologies. This slide is from a retreat in Portugal we did with 600 plus people from Consensus 6 years ago. And it's still true. I think it's an ethos a lot of us have in the industry, just bringing more people on board with great user experiences. Thank you.